So hello, welcome back to the Genealogy of the Core Enaction series. This is our second session. In the first session 2 weeks ago, we introduced the genealogical path towards Francisco Varela's enactive approach that we intend to co-explore in these sessions. And this based on an overview of the evolution of the research tradition of experimental epistemology. And today we will start our in-depth co-exploration of this genealogical path with a lecture by Professor Bruce Clarke, a lecture dedicated to the cybernetic origins of Enaction, and then a discussion based on questions from all of us, from the participants, from the organizers, other speakers. And between the lecture and the discussion, we will have a break, a short break. I think a 10 minutes break will be enough, which who likes the idea can spend in our virtual coffee break room, and Joanna will explain to you how to reach this room at the beginning of the break. So let me very briefly introduce Professor Bruce Clarke, who was already with us during the introductory session. He's Professor of Literature and Science at the Texas Tech University, and has held many relevant scientific roles, among which NASA and Library of Congress Chair of Astrobiology. And Professor Clarke has been working extensively and with a very deep, original transdisciplinary approach to the cybernetics and to the cybernetics origin of Enaction, and has been developing this research path by intertwining system theory, Gaia theory, and narrative theory. I hope you had a chance or will have a chance to visit the site which is related to his Gaian Systems project, which is really wonderful, and to read his books, really marvelous books. The last one, the most recent one, is Writing Gaia, which is dedicated to the scientific correspondence between James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. He co-edited this book with Sébastien Dutreuil, and the book is published, is distributed right now, is published by Cambridge University Press. But also a very beautiful book is Gaian Systems, which was published in 2020, and Neo Cybernetics and Narrative, published in 2014, both by a University of Minnesota Press. So I think we are very honored, and I think we are very lucky to have with us Professor Bruce Clarke, and for this really incredible lecture. So I leave you the stage.
Thank you, Louisa. Okay, let's hope for the best here. How about this one?
Fantastic, we can see.
Okay. All right, everybody. Well, here's the latest version of the title, giving myself some leeway for miscellaneous material, although I think I've got a story to tell, and the line going through the story will be fairly straightforward. So scenes from Francisco Varela's cybernetic genealogy. Let's get it going. So I'll just state my feeling flat out that the first generation cyberneticist with whom Varela's intellectual career is most consequentially linked, of all the many people you can link him to, is Heinz von Förster. And Varela himself published several testimonies to this connection. For instance, an introduction to the volume Observing Systems, a selection of von Förster's papers first published in 1981, and really the only selection that was available that gave you a compendium of von Förster's cybernetic works until a much later selected edition came out in 2003 called Understanding, which is, and that one you should buy because you can't find Observing Systems anymore. But in it, he had this lovely opening remark. Like almost everyone who came into contact with Heinz von Förster, I owe him a great deal. I say a great deal of learning because Heinz excels at being able to inspire others to think about deep issues which he can point to and express in substantious nutshells. I thought that is just a great sort of not exactly idiomatic, but a wonderful characterization of the compression in that one comes to appreciate in von Foerster's writings. As he himself once told me, Varela continues, to understand something is to stand under it so that you may foster its development. And he acted every word of that. And the relationship between these two, I mean, is very much once they form, it's not a collaboration very much, but it's a I think he picks up the mentor role for Maturana in a way, and then he just boosts Varela because he sees the brilliance that has come his way. So, all right. So now I need to just move my speaker bar here a second. There we go. Hang on, just so I can see my own text here. Well, who was von Foerster? How did this Austrian expatriate polymath come to befriend this young Chilean genius? Of course, this happens in 1968, but let's go back to 1940. Both had the experience of fleeing political intimidation in authoritarian societies. And so just the information about the precariousness of Heinz's situation during the Nazi years is laid out in Muller and Muller's An Unfinished Revolution, where I get this information from, but where we learn that according to the Nuremberg laws of racial gradation, Heinz was a Mischling, Zweiten Grades, second-degree mixed race or mongrel in the less polite terminology. So there he was, reasonably socially prominent in Vienna. He moved his family to Berlin, where he could hide in plain sight. And somehow or another, there's a picture of Heinz in Nazi Berlin that is preserved in his papers. So that's kind of how he made it through the Nazi years, by working for a Nazi company in Berlin on radio technology, basically. But in any event, he survived. Hang on here. There we go. Now, he decided to emigrate after being back in Austria for a few years. This was the incredible coincidence and series of connections that brought him full-time to the US. He produced a short monograph. The English title is Memory, a Quantum Mechanical Investigation. This got into the hands of Warren S. McCulloch, and McCulloch was totally impressed by Heinz and by his ideas. He was at the University of Illinois Medical School at the time. He helped, and that's why Heinz landed at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign through the help McCulloch gave him getting a job in what was then the electron tube laboratory in the electrical engineering department. All this, of course, just before solid state electronics had arrived in the 50s. But the crucial thing then was that he brought von Foerster into the Macy conferences. As they were at about midway through a 7 or 8 year run, Heinz came in midway alongside the formidable, I'm just going to admit these users since I can do that, group of the first generation cyberneticists, Norbert Wiener first among that group as the coiner of the name cybernetics, but von Neumann, Claude Shannon, and Bateson and Mead on the anthropological side of cybernetic interest. And famously, McCulloch appointed von Förster as the editor of the subsequent Macy transactions to help improve his abysmal English. And so he accepted this role, and then he is listed as the editor of the last 3 or 4 volumes of transcribing the conversations at the Macy conferences. But this is how Heinz went from a kind of undefined technician trained in physics to getting on the path of cybernetic science and cybernetic investigation. McCulloch is really the crucial person who catalyzed this transformation in Heinz's career. And since we have a letter attesting to that, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at it. So while this is right when von Förster and McCulloch have their first, right after their first meeting, and he writes to the head of the Macy conferences, Frank Fremont Smith. He says, "I've asked Dr. Heinz von Förster in theoretical physics and an engineer whose chief work has been on microwaves and surface rectifiers to drop in and talk to you." That Heinz was in New York City, and that's where Fremont Smith was. Had the pleasure of a society for 3 days, during which time we've talked very much of his theory of memory, approaching the problem of retention as a quantum physicist. He's proposed a mechanism which is entirely in harmony with everything that we know of biological processes in general and brains in particular. It's the most exciting thing on this score that I have yet encountered. So that's pretty high praise from this eminent scientist in the middle of the run of the Macy conferences. And so the rest of the letter here is about helping him establish himself in America and also seeing if we can't fit him into the program of the upcoming meeting, and all of that takes place in due course. And so here we are at the 1952, or one of the 1952 later Macy conferences. This is what they look like. There's Heinz on the right, McCulloch at the head of the table, and the other correspondents. And the title, up until this point, the name under which these conferences were proceeding was some permutation of circular causal and feedback mechanisms in biological and social systems. One of Heinz's first suggestions as editor of the transactions was just, why don't we just call it cybernetics? And everyone thought, that sounds good. Now we'll just have to tell them what cybernetics means, but it's kind of about feedback mechanisms in systems of various sorts. So there's the rest of the room in this particular photo shot. There's the back of Bateson's head on the left, and Margaret Mead over on the other side of the table. So Heinz immediately established personal and professional connections with this fairly august body of high-level researchers in the US at the beginning of the 1950s. Now, von Förster particularly resonated, I think, intellectually in terms of his own preparation. He resonated with the seminal theoretical statement. We heard a little bit about this last week, published in 1943 by McCulloch and his collaborator Walter Pitts, a logical calculus of the ideas immanent in nervous activity. So this work introduced an iconography for idealized, that is, strictly all or nothing or digital neurons to illustrate the byways of its logical calculus. So when you use this particular notation, on the picture here, on the left is the diagrams that were present in the paper by McCulloch and Pitts. On the right is a semantic translation, and that's out of the paper by Lily Kay. So that's really handy in that you can see what the point of these notations was, that if the neurons and their mode of firing was diagrammed in such a way, you get these different logical categories, such as precession or disjunction or conjunction. And that's how this logic was used to model what might be the throughput of an idea in terms of its neuronal implementation. So that's the look of this kind of diagrammatics of the brain as a control system at this very early moment in cybernetic thinking. So Heinz really got into this stuff. And then if you get to take a look, and this is a new slide I threw in after I sent the sponsors my most recent version. I just thought, just for evidence, that Heinz's own papers are full of McCulloch-Pitts neurons. It's really an abiding mode of demonstration of the kinds of points about biological computation, right? This is what's going on with the neurons in terms of this sort of McCulloch architecture and this way of doing cybernetics coming out of the first generation. But this is, by the way, this is one of the key papers by Heinz von Förster on constructing a reality. I'm not going to go into it beyond showing you this page where Maturana is elicited from one of his papers on color vision at the end of the 60s. But this is the kind of thing that Varela would, at this very early stage of their interrelation, would be picking up on this kind of constructivist argument. And this is one of sort of the perhaps most well-known of von Förster's treatments of what we now call what I call epistemological constructivism. Radical or not is up to you. But anyways, just to jump ahead, that's those are those same neurons, at least diagrammatically, that came out of that 1943 paper. Now, just to kind of summarize what I can gather in terms of the genealogy of ideas as McCulloch's ideas move into von Förster's way of thinking. Seems to me what we can say is that McCulloch teaches von Förster about the logical indetermination of biological computation in the nervous system. And here I'm moving up on this passage that I'll quote in a second, but what I take from it is that there's necessarily certain aporias in this architecture, that is sort of blind spots or gaps, disjunctions and circularities in the logical relations of nervous nets that release their productions from what an AI researcher might idealize as determinability, predictability in the operation of such computations. What McCulloch is showing is that you can't get that out of the nervous net approach that he's using. And he draws this conclusion at the very end of that paper, where he writes with Pitts, specification of the nervous net provides the law of necessary connection whereby one can compute from the description of any state to that of the succeeding state, but the inclusion of disjunctive relations, remember there's a little diagram and it was disjunction is what's happening if the neurons go like this. The inclusion of disjunctive relations prevents complete determination of the one before. There's a disjunction. Moreover, the regenerative activity of constituent circles renders reference indefinite to time past. And here what he's thinking about is feedback circuits, right? Classic cybernetic descriptors of circular operations that then sort of break up that alter profoundly what otherwise one thinks of as just the linearity of a computation. So, and these regenerative constituent circles render reference indefinite to time past, and thus our knowledge of the world, including ourselves, is incomplete as to space and indefinite as to time. This ignorance implicit in all our brains is the counterpart of the abstraction which renders our knowledge useful. So I think this is, to me, this is an important epistemological moment with regard to the limits, that there are limits that biological computation cannot be rendered completely transparent to an observer. And if, in any event, an idea like that seems to me very much in the prehistory of von Förster's idea that you may have heard of his concept of the non-trivial machine, that is a system whose dialogue with its environment cannot be predicted. So a living system is by definition a non-trivial machine. And I would venture to say Varela's concept of biological autonomy could be placed as a further unfolding of this insight. And so my sort of summary at the moment with regard to the epistemological issue would be that an experimental epistemology, which is the through line coming from McCulloch to von Förster and Varela here, equally concerns the determination of what stays unknown or what cannot be realized, what cannot be known by a given system. Now, moving up to the biological computer laboratory in 1958. And my text is obscured for some reason, but what it says, you can read it at the top there. So 1958 was when he began he had been working in that electron tube lab, but he kind of handed it to some guys at the point where he's ready to start his own lab and had the support to do that. So 1958, birth of the biological computer lab, and he gives an interview to the school newspaper. And the question exactly, how does the word biological fit? Because when we think of computation and computers, and we don't have sort of this kind of cybernetic sophistication, we think, well, how, it sounds oxymoronic, or at least like a clash. And obvious, I think it's clear that's what Heinz wanted. He wanted that tension of seemingly incompatible ideas to sort of declare the sort of the innovations that he was looking for to pursue in his lab. So anyways, these are just some quotes from the article here. A biological computer. But that he was going to build a biological computer, and that was why the lab was given the name it was, in which he plans to trade the speed of the regular computing machine for intelligent behavior. This computer plan its own program. It may make errors just as humans, but mostly, but it won't be idealized as an error-free, as a kind of non-humanly perfect computing device. And defining intelligence as insight into behavior, he's attempting to build neurons. And of course, the McCulloch-Pitts formalism is what he's going to be instantiating, that reproduce the characteristics of living neuron as closely as possible. But it will be nonlinear, the computer now, which means that the response will depend on its own state. Okay, and there's the regenerative circularity, which is so it's kind of intrinsic to this mode of cybernetic epistemology. The computer will be nonlinear, which means the response will depend on its own, not on what the input is from the outside operator, but the state the system is arrived at due to its own operations. Okay. Just as a person constantly changes through each contact, so will the neuron of the biological computer change. And then this statement, which is pure kind of von Fürsterian humor, no one will ever be able to tell exactly how the machine actually works. That's the machine I want to build, one that I can't predict, and I can't even tell you how it's arriving at the output that it gives, because it's determining it from its own states. So it's kind of like an autonomous, it's almost like computational autonomy. I don't know, that pops into my head, and I don't know if that's, anyways, take that for what you will. But hey, talking about indeterminability, give me 5 neurons, I'll give you 100 million different possible combinations. Which one are you going to predict? Okay, so that's the ambience of the biological computer lab in terms of von Fürster's own stated goals for the research that he's going to carry out there. So meanwhile, we're up to the end of the 50s now, and around the same time, another international researcher, here's, of course, Maturana, who's specifically trained in neurophysiological experimentation and research, would spend significant amounts of time at MIT working in the lab of Jerome Letvin, but McCulloch and Pitts were just down the hall, and they were working collaboratively. So Maturana on his own and quite independently comes into the orbit of McCulloch's research. And they mutually co-author the famous paper of 1959, classic of epistemological constructivism, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. So very short synopsis would be of what they found in the experiments they did. Precise mapping of neuronal activity in the frog's eye indicates that the frog sensorium has evolved sort of as a total organ of the life form of the frog, has evolved to bring forth not a raw or neutral world, not just a strictly representational world, but one predisposed in its own sort of biological architecture to make its preferred prey, which would be a fly, stand sharply out from its environmental surround. Okay, so what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain is not what the world is like, but kind of, where the flies are so that you can snap them up. And here's the title page of that paper, just to get the look of the thing. And a passage from the conclusion in their own words, which say, so they kind of find that there's 4 different active retinal mechanisms or aspects that combine in the eye of the frog, but one of them is the bug perceiver. So, a specific fiber then responds best when a dark object enters the field, stops, then moves intermittently. Okay. So the processing of that receptor is the one that makes that aspect of the world stand out most dramatically, so that the frog can get the fly and maintain its autopoiesis, as we would say, just at the sheer level of its metabolic continuation. Okay, so that's what was this paper, as I understand, got an unusual amount of traction, and then retrospectively was seen as an important experimental demonstration of the epistemological orientation of that would go into second order cybernetics. So, just summarizing some history here on our genealogy. Von Förster and Maturana met in person in 1962. There's a wonderful, it's on the bibliography that's listed. There's a 1995 interview with Heinz and some guys at Stanford, and you can get the full text of this story. But suffice it to say, they skipped out on the dress rehearsal so they could visit Amsterdam and thereby bonded, because then they were kind of, when they came back to actually do the conference, they were the bad sheep, as the phrase that. But anyway, you can imagine how that would bond you to someone if you sort of were both, kind of participated in playing hooky from your scholarly conference. Anyways, they became very fast friends. They visited, Heinz went to Chile. Maturana came to the BCL on multiple occasions. And Heinz was keenly interested throughout, I mean, from the get-go, especially in Maturana's dedicated experimental work on vision and color perception. And so when you see for instance, in the embodied mind, there's a long section on color vision. And Varela's interest in this and his continuing down this line of epistemological, neurological investigation. This is direct inheritance from his training with Maturana. So in due time, Varela would be invited to the BCL. In fact, immediately when he flew to Boston to take up his scholarship at Harvard in the winter of 1968, in fact, Heinz arranged for a quick excursion over to the BCL, and the result of which is that Varela then applied to the University of Illinois in the Department of Physiology, and of course it would have been to work with Heinz. And so interestingly, in the same archive, and the main archive here of these papers from the archives at University of Illinois, there's Varela's statement of purpose on his application to do doctoral work. So I thought it'd be fun just to see how clearly he had thought through his scientific ambitions. Well, this is what he put on the application. My professional goal is the understanding of the nervous system from both the physiological and the theoretical point of view, right? So that would be not just straightforward physiological investigation, but I mean, very much in line with Maturana's sort of theoretical development out of that very kind of work. The theoretical view would would be the formalization, or at least would entail also the formalization, the mathematization of the physiological operations. As we already see that, it's kind of that's the line of McCulloch logical diagrammatics. My intention is to concentrate in the neuron-to-neuron interaction and to develop a mathematical apparatus to describe these interactions as a first step towards a more broad theoretical mathematical frame for the biological sciences. So I think he, his purpose was firm from this would be January 1968 when he lays it out like this. Well, Varela did not, in the end, he stayed at Harvard. He didn't go to Illinois to work directly with von Förster, but they clearly hit it off, and they're sort of their relationship is basically produced and maintained from this time on through fairly constant, if not constant, but the file of correspondence that I found in the archives there was pretty thick. Here's an early letter from Varela to von Förster. Varela tends not to give the years when he puts the date on, so it's kind of a guessing game. But I think my guess is this is written at the end of 1968. It appears that Heinz had come to Cambridge, so that had to be Harvard or MIT because they're not talking about England. And he says, it was a real thrill to see and hear you in Cambridge the other day. More than ever, I could admire your extraordinary ability to go straight to the core of the argument with elegant simplicity. I hope it is something I will learn how to do someday. I think you have to say, oh yeah, he learned how to do that. But it was those substantious nutshells, right? Just go straight to the core and put it in that substantious nutshell, and then it's like a seed for future thinking. There appears to be an invitation that would have been from Heinz already for a return visit, because he's saying, of course, I am very interested in coming out. And I love what he says now. I could give a seminar on visual processing in insect retinas, because that was the mainstream experimental physiological work that he was doing at Harvard, and he put papers out on this. But he also says, also, it would be quite nice if you think is worth to submit some of my thoughts on the role of language for the study of mind, which is a completely different line of discussion from the visual processing in insect retinas. I mean, now we're just talking some kind of philosophical engagement with textual understanding. In other words, you see the philosophical preparation that really made Varela stand out and made him unique, especially in an American milieu of intense specialization. Says, I could give you a straight science paper on insect retinas, or I could give you a philosophical discourse on what? The role of language for the study of mind, which is a rather large topic. Anyways, but, and then finally, just as a kind of afterthought, he says, I found this neat article on self-reference. And that's we already see that logical circularity that runs alongside the biological circularity as that comes to be defined in the autopoietic concept, that a shared interest in the logic of self-reference is going to be a powerful point of connection between von Förster and Varela. As I say, a mutual interest in a topic pregnant with autopoietic and second-order cybernetic futurity, self-reference, etc., right? And everything that kind of unfolds from the recovery of self-reference as something you can actually work with in a non-paradoxical way, or you can overcome the paradoxical potential of self-reference that's tended to push it off into the margins of what's considered proper. All right. Okay. Now we're going to shift gears here and talk about a different venue. We're going to go to California in the just after the Summer of Love. Going to switch to the emergence of the Whole Earth Catalog as a place where important cybernetics were brought forward and publicized, this becomes, I'm bringing this out especially because this becomes a precise nexus where at which von Förster and Varela would participate, although those main developments come at later on in the 70s. But just to remind you, I consider this a seminal event in the immediate prehistory of second-order cybernetics. Stuart Brand was it was his brainchild, really, completely. Very fascinating character who's still with us. And as you can see, it's the ambience of its interest is in, I mean, the tools are immediately meant for the people going off grid and dropping out and starting communes, and then they need stuff. They need tools and stoves, and just they need to know how to live off the grid. And that was sort of the manifest social intention of the catalog, but it was full of intellectual content and, crucially, cybernetic content, and that's what we're interested in. So, so there was a cybernetic orientation, as I'll unfold just a little bit more, but here's the programmatic statement. In other words, there's systems thinking was deeply infused into the project of the Whole Earth Catalog, and one way they declared that was with this motto on the back cover: the flow of energy through a system acts to organize that system. Okay, and of course, the Earth is the system they're talking about, and the sun is the energy source. So we're talking large scale, whole Earth thinking about energy and information, if that's what you want to think, organization here is, would fall into the vocabulary of the interest in the connection between energy and information theoretical connections running right alongside the cybernetic discussion during this period. So this is the book Morowitz's Energy Flow in Biology, from which that motto was taken. It just struck me that even at this early moment, this is like the second iteration, the Spring '69 number of the Whole Earth Catalog, but its whole systems thinking, its cybernetics were already distinctly ecological in orientation. It was ecosystemic systems thinking that was just a major component of the editorial sensibility of Stuart Brand, anyways. And so there was a slant towards living systems in the cybernetics of the Whole Earth Catalog. That's the point I'm trying to make. But also here, I don't know, I wrote this out. Cybernetics in the Whole Earth Catalog was distinctly ecological, partial to living systems, thus by default, countercultural. If the mainstream culture of cybernetics is technological, computer-oriented, machine-oriented, living systems, it's the biological side of that coin that is the ambience of second-order cybernetics, of Varela's work, obviously, as it connects to this, this project that became sort of an enabling occasion for the larger sort of world of the systems counterculture that develops at this moment. So for instance, if you open up the Whole Earth Catalog, in some previous writing, I've called it the house organ. I just virtually considered it was the house organ of the systems counterculture. Always began with the section called Understanding Whole Systems. Buckminster Fuller was the kind of the guru for the Whole Earth Catalog right at that moment in American culture. He had just brought out Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, which became one of his sort of iconic publications. You can see how that sat nicely beside the Whole Earth idea as a serious mode of systems thinking regarding ecological matters and kind of survivability on a cold warring planet at the end of the 1960s. Earthrise is the picture that's shown on the cover, of course, taken by NASA on Christmas Eve, 1968. So now, to get back to Heinz, we know that Heinz was a fan of the Whole Earth Catalog because in his classes at Illinois, he set up a student project called the Whole University Catalog, and they made their own catalog. So Brand got word of Heinz's interest, and then when this curious book called Laws of Form by Spencer Brown landed on his desk, he looked around for someone who could comprehend this book, and who he found was von Förster. So as it worked out, von Förster contributed. This is a very long, like 3 or 4 times longer than the usual review. So it really opens up the laws of form. And I'm assuming most people are familiar with just the larger importance of Spencer Brown's work for the milieu of second order cybernetics. But suffice it to say, it was a line of connection that very tightly united the interests of Heinz and Francisco. But this is before Francisco really, I mean, I don't know if he read the Whole Earth Catalog, but why not? But anyway, so here's this first appeared in spring 1970. The book was published in 69. And I'll just give you the taste of von Förster's review right at the beginning is just, I mean, you just can't beat that opening line. The laws of form have finally been written. As if they were always there. As if they were somehow obvious and lying around and somebody just had to like write them down. With a Spencer Brown transistorized power razor, a 20th century model of Occam's razor, right? The point just being what you could use the calculus for is just to strip the logic of your matters of interest down to the most penetrating central expression, right? And just and by that sort of apply Occam's principle that in general, the simplest explanation that actually does explain the thing is probably the right one. Well, what about these laws? I mean, laws are not descriptions. Laws are commands, injunctions, do. Thus, the first constructive proposition in this book is the injunction, draw a distinction. Talking cognitive science here, people. It's kind of where it all starts. At least that's the argument here. Draw a distinction. Now we got something to talk about. Now we're out of the unmarked state and we're on the way to an indication, and matters can roll on from there. And as he says, and I just want to draw out one point from it, the way Heinz continues here. After this, he says, practically everything else follows smoothly with regard to the total package that you get from this book. A rigorous foundation of arithmetic, of algebra, of logic, of a calculus of indications, intentions, and desires. A rigorous development of laws of form, may they be of logical relations, of descriptions of the universe by physicists and cosmologists, or of functions of the nervous system which generates descriptions of the universe of which it is a part. So notice what he's unfolding here is kind of the line back to the epistemological conditions of possibility, right? That behind these scientists, looking at the world and describing it one way or another, these fundamental neurological cognitive organs that are and the thing to see, what he's subtly talking about is self-reference, saying usually the observer of the cosmos leaves themselves out of the picture. They say, here's the cosmos, it's just me, but don't worry about me. But he's saying no, in fact, your nervous system is part of your cognitive apparatus, and your cognitive apparatus is part of the universe, it's part of the cosmos, right? You have to see yourself in that same tableau. So anyways, it's not explicitly stated, but I think you can see that the way that Heinz thinks deeply into the primary self-referentiality of cognitive operations is implicit in the way he lines up what's going on in laws of form. Now, chronologically, then, just sliding back over to what's going on with Varela, by the beginning of the 70s, he's taken his doctorate at Harvard. He's gone back to Chile. He's gone back to university collaboration with Maturana. And this is and it's in this moment that the concept of autopoiesis finds its name and the first writings developing it, collaborative writings of Matron and Varela have arrived at their, I mean, the time is this, this is when it happens. And this passage that I'm giving here is from Varela's own account of this moment, which is the, right, it's from it's in the bibliography. So if you want to go check it out. I thought it was interesting then that, because I hadn't previously noticed how he takes McCulloch, this is McCulloch's phrase for doing this kind of science. And Varela just lays the the emergence of autopoiesis directly into this line of affiliation with McCulloch's experimental epistemology. And it's also very nicely kind of establishes the emergence of autopoiesis on this particular history of close debate and conversation in Maturana's lab. He says those were times of search and discussion focusing on what seemed a dissatisfaction and anomaly. A basic dissatisfaction was the notion of information, dissatisfaction, right, with the notion of information as the key to understanding the brain and cognition. The idea didn't appear to play an explicit role in the biological process, and Umberto's intuition was that living beings are, as he said in those days, self-referred. And in some way, the nervous system was capable of generating its own conditions of reference. Well, I think probably most of us are familiar with this, very basic way of articulating the idea of autopoiesis. But I just found it fascinating that Maturana had articulated this through the discourse of self-reference, and this is just very much, again, in terms of this line of approach, Maturana, von Förster, Varela, they're really peas in the same pod. Yeah, and given all that, Varela continues, it was a question of reformulating an orientation, that's sort of an orientation towards trying to find a non-informatic way into biological cognition, and which moves us out of the sort of general mainstream approach, and moving it into this other groove of experimental epistemology, where the sort of the resources of that approach could be brought to bear. And now, just to pinpoint what's going on in Varela's life at this moment, this is at the end of the early days of autopoiesis, is sort of when he has to hightail it out of Chile, feeling under threat from the Pinochet regime, and being part of a diaspora, which did not include Maturana, who decided to tough it out. But I think clearly Varela needed to go to feel safe about himself and his family. With the diaspora of the department scientist ended a period of science in Chile, an important stage of my personal life, and with it the context which gave birth to the idea of autopoiesis. And that's why that article is really fascinating and important, because he explains how the wider milieu of new thinking in Chilean science in the 1960s made this possible, but now it's been busted up. But naturally, the idea would find new avatars outside of Chile. Of course, he's writing this retrospectively, but just as a practical matter, at this stage, not only does Varela take the message out, but he's already kind of developing the implications of autopoietic thinking beyond the concept of autopoiesis. Nevertheless, the term remains a major sort of starting point, shall we say, rallying point for the new epistemology. And it's von Förster who now lends incredible support to make this idea. So that's what I'd say. The most significant new avatar of the concept of autopoiesis is our friend Heinz von Förster, and here's how some of that happens. But meanwhile, the first place Varela was able to get on as far as bringing in an income was at the Universidad Nacional in Costa Rica. And while he's there for about a year, and this is where so this would be 1974. In other words, because that's the year that he leaves Chile at the end of 73, right? So he's already drafting up this paper called A Calculus for Self-Reference. And he sends Heinz this draft copy. I say here, draft of a new paper suggesting that if you give the supplement, which he's going to propose in the paper, to the calculus of the laws of form, could open it directly to issues of biological autonomy. But he creates this very lovely cover for the draft, whatever shape the manuscript was in underneath this cover image. And so what's fun here is that he's borrowed that Ouroboros came directly out of the cybernetics of cybernetics, which I don't, anyways, this is, which all 500 pages of the cybernetics of cybernetics, that was one of the final projects done at the BCL in Heinz's heuristics classes before he had to shut down, before he just took retirement at 65 and closed up the biological computer lab. So we're in the last year or two of the life of the biological computer lab. But here's the Ouroboros that Heinz had many different versions, but of course the Ouroboros is the emblem of self-reference. And here, or circularity, or it's how you get, a first order cybernetics, the snake would not bite its own tail. The snake would just be a linear object moving from one place to the next. But once you close the circle, create the feedback or whatever the circular dynamic is, now you've got the cybernetics of cybernetics, the cybernetics of observing systems. I just thought the archive provided here a nice iconic connectedness of what Varela took himself to be doing when he went back to laws of form and did his own spin on it, and then sent it to the other world's greatest laws of form fan, which was Heinz von Förster. Okay, so now we're fully into the era where second order cybernetics and the concept of autopoiesis sort of connect together chronologically as well as conceptually. Because here's the famous first paper in English. And if you don't mind, something that just the diagram here comes out of the tree of knowledge, right? But I've thought, well, perhaps we could see here the Ouroboros of autopoiesis. In any event, if you get to the end, you get past the computer tessellations and the modeling going on in this paper, you find this acknowledgement to Heinz and his collaborators at the biological computer lab. But more than that, Heinz basically sent the paper. He sent the paper directly to Biosystems, and that's how it got there. also in 74. All right, hang on. I'm having to get this guy out again. Okay. All right, moving right along. Yeah. So that draft paper then, so Heinz also then had an idea for an outlet for a calculus for self-reference, not only, and then he also, so he was responsible for placing a calculus for self-reference in the International Journal of General Systems, not only with Varela's long, fascinating text, but with a, I don't know if I can, but they wrote up a long introductory statement, Richard Howe and Heinz von Förster. Okay, so it wasn't merely the vetting and the placing of the paper, but the provision of contextual, just kind of an antechamber to bring someone up to speed to dive into this paper of Varela's. So here's my image of Varela from the title of my talk is from this paper here. So I don't know if Varela wrote this biography himself. I mean, why wouldn't he? But he goes on to say his scientific activity is centered around the problems of biocomputers, both molecular and cognitive. It's interesting to me if that would have in fact been the way that Varela expressed his activity right at that moment, not only with the mark of the biological computer lab, but also John Lilly, who won't otherwise enter this conversation today, but he's also in the background with his concept of programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer. So that's another line coming off the cybernetics of this moment. Okay, now we're kind of going to finish it up with a bit of a dive into this particular paper because it seems to me to very explicitly tie together this line of experimental epistemology but also to bring in recursion, self-reference, autopoiesis, and show how they all, at least in Varela's mind at this moment, sort of were part and parcel of the same activity of theoretical thought. So this paper begins with self-reference is awkward. I mean, usually we stumble around when we encounter it. One may find the axioms in the explanation, the brain writing its own theory. Okay? That's almost here Heinz von Förster there, but that's sort of a standard constructivist point, you know, of implication of the observer in their observations, a cell computing its own computer, the observer and the observed, the snake eating its own tail in a ceaselessly generative process. And that's the Ouroboros. Let's see here. Stubbornly, these occurrences appear as outstanding in our experience. I think that just means now that I can kind of see this dynamic, I see it everywhere. Stubbornly, instances of self-reference keep popping up. But particularly obvious is the case of living systems. You know, you want to talk about self-reference? Take your living system where the self-producing nature of their entire dynamic is easy to observe. And it is this very fact that can be taken as a characterization for the organization of living systems. And he's just referring the very initial work on the concept of autopoiesis. Similarly, the physiological and cognitive organization of a self-conscious system, right? So here's your mind, may be understood as arising from a circular and recursive neuronal network containing its own description as a source for further descriptions. And this is just the larger work of Maturana, for sure, coming down the line of McCulloch's experimental epistemology. So Varela's calculus introduces, in this particular paper, a new symbolic value, the operation of an autonomous state, a name to indicate the dynamics of self-referential productions. So I'm going to skirt lightly by the minutia of the Spencer-Brown formalisms, but this is highly recognizable as the form of cancellation, the law of crossing from the very beginning of the laws of form. So that's right there. This is Varela's innovation here, right? Because there's just the mark of distinction, and there's the mark of the self cross. And so you say cross over from your state of autonomy, and you're still in the state of autonomy. So that's seems to be how that works. Now, I threw this in real quick, but I'm not, we can't, just to say, out there in the world, the Spencer-Brown formalism has been observed by people that are kind of not in the, not necessarily Spencer-Brownian acolytes, but here's, I mean, Wolfram's math world take on it is out there. It's too much for my little brain, but if someone has the math, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is, here's the critique, because I've talked around to my laws of form people, and what do you think of what Varela did in A Calculus for Self-Reference? And the usual things, well, it's kind of like it was already there implicit in it's not really necessary, or it wasn't that big a difference from what was already there. I can't answer that question. That's why we need Louis Kaufman, who's our resident expert on the laws of form. But this, as far as I know, this is the standard dismissal. But it also means that Varela's number on laws of form is still, I mean, it's still being tracked. It's in the literature as an important moment, even if you don't agree that it did anything particularly important. And so what they say is the obvious problem is of this modification is that the form could not draw a distinction between two autonomous states. I want to throw this out to somebody to tell me if I should. I just think, but isn't it? All I'm saying is my level of ignorance here is pretty intense. But the way I would come back at this, and I'd love to know if this would work, is that it sounds like you're not taking temporality into account, because that's exactly what von Förster showed. And we know that Varela understood that book 11 of the laws of form introduced a kind of antinomic operator already, or an imaginary state. It introduced an imaginary state into the form. And the result of that was to bring temporality. And then you saw it wasn't a kind of timeless calculus, but that it could handle forms in time. And if you've got temporal distinction, then why don't you have a distinction between the autonomous state at T1 and the autonomous state at T2? Isn't that how the distinction would work? I don't know. I'm going to leave it there. I shouldn't have thrown this stuff in anyways, but just so you know, it's kind of out there. And if anyone dives into it, I'd love to know what you think about it. But Meanwhile, back to Varela's own paper. See, I think, be all that as it may, the crucial thing that's going on here, and this, as I was telling Amy and the others before we started, this is my new intuition about what this is all about, having kind of lined it up in the process of writing this paper. So I'll throw this out there as my attempt at indicating exactly what is the new thing here, what is the important thing that's going on here for Varela's ongoing work and thought. So it appears to me that Varela's extension of Spencer Brown's laws of form brings the mathematical spirit of McCulloch's logical calculus, way back there in 43, into a new system of notation for cognitive computations. So he can now generalize from neuronal logic, that's what's there in the abstractions of McCulloch, to the calculus of distinctions altogether, while moving laws of forms formalisms into the biological arena. I think that's the crucial thing here, that it isn't just this sort of dry, abstract, utterly mathematical, detached consideration, but it's that the self-referential dynamics that you can model through the laws of form is a way of coming to grips with the circularity of biological and neuronal and cognitive processes. So if I'm right, then Varela links the form of autonomy through the concept of self-reference to the operation of biotic autopoiesis. And if all that kind of holds together, then here's also a manifest extension of von Foerster's own pursuit of biological computation, as inspired as well by McCulloch's notation in his experimental epistemology. So to bring this all to a conclusion, I'm going to use Varela's some of his final statements in this paper. So the conclusion of a calculus for self-reference, on the one hand, it drives home von Foerster's own constructivist program, because this is exactly the sort of thing that Heinz is developing on constructing a reality. A statement like, in contrast with what is commonly assumed, a description, when carefully inspected, reveals the properties of the observer, as well as whatever it manages to describe in the object that's being observed. We, observers, distinguish ourselves precisely by distinguishing what we apparently are not, the world. So, as he continues, his conclusion also amplifies this line of von Foerster's thinking by describing the cognitive dynamism and incessant temporally unfolding cycling of states. Again, I think it's that temporality is a crucial point that needs to be picked up. So as these things go around, they just don't merely go around in circles, they go around in time. And so here's an expression of the computation of a world that contains both the observer and the environment that they bring forth as a total package. So this is Varela, and we'll end with this. We then see that we stand in relation to the world by mutual negation, and that the union of us two, cognizer and world cognized, I think he means by us two, has therefore an autonomous structure whereby the negation engenders a distinction which leads to its own negation in a ceaseless circular process, which is in fact the symbol, that's the Ouroboros, which tradition has chosen to represent the creation of everything since time immemorial. It's all inside somehow that final limit of cognitive possibility. Thank you. Thanks for your interest. We're done. There you go.
Much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. Really, thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
We have a 10 minutes break now. So there is the virtual coffee break room. Joanna?
Yep. So we'll aim to be back in the main room at, I would say, 7:31. So in 10 minutes, 7:31 p.m. And I'm just going to open up one breakout room, which you can choose to join if you'd like, just for casual exchange. And so I'll launch that right now. Otherwise, for those of you watching on YouTube, there will be a 10-minute pause. And so we'll be back in the main room for the main discussion in 10 minutes. And this is also a time when, as you're letting the story and all these ideas settle, to think of questions that you have for the discussion period that we'll have after the break. So start thinking of those. So see you back in 10 minutes.
I hadn't lectured in a while. As you can see,
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
yeah.
Absolutely. Very exciting.
I don't have a chance to lecture on this kind of stuff in the teaching I do at Tech, unfortunately. So this is really a great treat.
Well, it was certainly an amazing treat for us.
Yes.
It was. It was like the movies.
Just a quick note:
right?
we're still being live streamed, so we're the main.
Well, I won't say anything.
Okay.
Great, a great class on the history of the concept. Very nice. Unfortunately, I teach right now, then I'm going to disappear. I apologize.
But we'll see you next time we get together.
Next week.
Okay. I'm very much looking forward to that. And
I have, yes, we are very complimentary. You are going to see.
I thought I tried not to. I could have spoken about that amazing meeting, but in any event, you will bring it forward, and we'll learn about how that went down. Okay. Hello, Chris.
Hey there. Hey, Bruce. I meant to ask you, since you were in my little group last time, have you read Evan Thompson's Mind and Life by any chance? Or
I kind of read around it, but I confess I haven't dove in.
Okay. I was just, I mean, it's almost like an encyclopedia in a way, and it really brings together just so many seemingly disparate. It's interesting to find people here, like how they got here, because it took me, at least a decade to just, it's almost like you see something that's different and interesting in a way that other things aren't. And then it's as if everybody sort of finds their way to the same kind of ideas, right? That somehow it's a different type of access to epistemology and to science that you don't really. Yeah. And I just think that Evan did such a good job putting that book together. And as I mentioned, I probably read it 20 times, and every time there's just so much there, and every time I get through it, it's like I see something I didn't see before. It's just one of those things. But the stuff you presented today was just like this a sort of like a backlog, of these little historical bits that, it all fits together. So, it's just like a little story. And for me to have spent so much time on these topics, it's like, it was really nice. I just really, really enjoyed that. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I had the good fortune of hearing Evan speak in his own right out of that kind of material when I hooked up with and Amy, I'm not sure. So there was this late run of meetings of the Lindisfarne Association, and Bill Thompson was still bringing that about, and Amy attended, and I'm sure Evan spoke at one point. So I kind of got Evan's at least kind of an overall sense of Evan's approach by osmosis a little bit back when I found my way to this discussion. And that'd be 2008, 2009, something like that.
Evan will be joining us at the end of this genealogy semester, and during the second and third semesters when we're reading The Embodied Mind. So we're very happy about that. He also, by the way, I don't know if you saw this, Bruno, but he also, by the way, did an absolutely magistral reading of Not One, Not Two, which is a 1976 article based on this idea of the distinction, of the mark for our Ouroboros series. So if you go onto the Mind and Life Europe YouTube channel, you'll see there's a series that we ran all through night.
Right, I attended a couple of those. I can't remember.
Yeah,
I remember I took extensive screenshots of DePaulo's talk. It was very helpful for me.
Yes, he did.
But anyway,
so
I'm gonna feed my cat, and I'll be back in half a second.
Okay, thanks. So Chris, you can have a look at the Mind and Life Europe YouTube channel, and you might know us already.
Well, I've been catching up. I don't remember how exactly I came upon it, and I've been kind of I looked at like Lewis Kaufman's talk.
Right.
Obviously, the laws of form is like this sort of almost intractable, but you can't. There's something there,
You did a great job with that, I thought.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I've been trying to just sort of review, and I mean, I have a million pages I've been writing down of questions and musings and whatnot. That's just I've dug in my crates, so to speak, of all the work that I've done over the past 15 years or so, and it's just you don't know where to start, but yeah, it's just really cool. I mean, definitely an endless amount of stuff to look at.
So Evan's talk comes right after Lou Kaufman's in that series, and so and it's really rich, one coming after the other, because Not One, Not Two, as some people on here know, is an article that leans on the laws of form and the interpretation of the mark of distinction. So.
Well, I will definitely be checking that out as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll get started with the main discussion. Apologies again about the breakout room. It seemed to have created multiple breakout rooms rather than one, but in any case, we're going to continue the main discussion here in the main room. So everyone's back, it looks like. So once again, this is structured as Louisa mentioned in the beginning, kind of like a Q&A, but also this is an occasion to share, your thoughts, your reactions to the lecture. So if you have any, questions, please feel free to step forward in the spirit of a true discussion. Just, you can raise your hand or signal that you'd like to speak. But if you feel a bit shy to speak, you can of course put your question or your comment in the chat. Absolutely no problem. And we'll try to bring them forward as they come up. So we have about 25 minutes or so for our discussion. And I know we did have some questions in the Slack already earlier this week. So if you wanted to bring those questions forward, this is also the occasion. You can do so. So Chris, if you wanted to go into your question at some point as well, you can feel free.
There was the reference before to draw a distinction. So Chris was asking about the distinction between the system and the environment in the Slack channel during the last lecture. I don't know if you, Chris, want to...
Let me, reframe. Yeah, I mean, so in my graduate work, we had, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Anthony Chamero, and he does the, some research, I forget where, but we actually, one of Francisco's students, Isabel Pichard, was my thesis advisor. And she brought him in to do, we all did like a little presentation for him. And then we went down to the Philosophy Club, which is a little bar in West Portal, San Francisco, and had an extensive conversation about many things. But, one of his main diagrams was he just simply, drew this, just drew a big loop around the individual and the environment and just said, there are one equals you, right? And then of course, he had these smaller equations, where he uses like finger wagging and stuff to show, how the oscillations will, change in their basically two states or whatever. But my question is like, when you get sort of, to a larger scale, when you want to say, how does the individual as a system relate to a larger social system? And when it's not so easy to just draw a formula, right, for something as simple as finger wagging, like how do we begin to think about that? Like what are some indicators that we might look for to say, well, this is a autonomous system or a unified system? And that's kind of where I was going with that, I think, if I remember correctly. Thank you.
So Bruno, do you have any?
Well, those are some large issues, and they're the level at which we left it in this talk is still kind of at the micro level, I would say, as far as because after all, autopoiesis is the kind of enabling fundamental operational circularity of the living instance, but its domain is the cell, right? And so the trickiness that ensues from that moment on is working out the dynamics of higher order autopoietic systems, if you want to take it in that, try to work up from the minimal, the minimal occasion of autopoiesis. Now, the discourse, social systems is, so I don't see that we're there. In other words, the epistemology that we looked at today remains, near as I see it, at the level of the individual observer. Okay, so you get that confrontation of, so that's the system. So each, for each of us, we have a confrontation with the universe. We bring forth a world that is in some significant way ours. We bring forth the world of which we are capable, given what we bring to the job of bringing forth the world. Now, there's sort of later developments in the enactive approach that proceed to the social. I'll have the temerity of mentioning that the systems theory of Niklas Luhmann has another way of getting to the social by way of a re-engineering of the concept of autopoiesis. And there you've got, then you've got Gordon Pask going back to the first generation of Heinz Förster colleagues. You've got all kinds of cybernetics, socio-cybernetics, cybernet management cybernetics, conversation theory. And in, I think, the part of Heinz von Förster we didn't get to today, but which I think hopefully connects to what you're asking about, is the matter of ethics. And in other words, ethics really supervenes when there's two people. When one person is in relation to another person and there's some necessity of coordinating the world that they mutually bring forth. And so maybe you might have seen this diagram that Heinz loved, and he places it in his paper, Objects, his paper on I'm blanking. It's in the Biblia. Something about eigenbehaviors, eigenforms, tokens for eigenbehaviors. In any event, if you open up that essay, you'll see this old clipping of one Ouroboros not eating its own tail, but the tail of a second Ouroboros who's coming around eating the tail of that. And so, in other words, you've still got you have the circularity of social, sort of a minimal social interaction being two autonomous individuals entering a domain of reciprocity. So the closure thesis then expands at that point to the conversation. And you want to?
Is the idea then as, let's just say, that new minimal state, these two people in reciprocity or whatever, a new system, are they together, like almost harmoniously taking in and transforming the same way the individual would, right?
It seems like, I mean, the idea is that would be the ideal situation, right. But there's no guarantee of mutuality, and there's no guarantee of permanence. In other words, that interlocking can arrive and then depart. But Heinz's own epistemology, I mean, the question then, the issue with regard to objectivity is, if everyone is bringing forth their own world, then how can we find a world we can all agree on? And of course, we're living through the negative dynamics of this social dysfunction of everyone saying, well, I want a world in which Donald Trump won the election. That's the one I want. Anyways, not to get too far off the boat here, but and I'm sure this is somewhere in a part of Varela that I haven't studied as deeply as it's his earlier stuff that I've kind of, in my archival work, that's the stuff that I'm most sort of deeply familiar with. But von Förster would say ethics is when we see ourselves through the eyes of the other. Okay, and that's a kind of minimal occasion for the it's not for the stabilization of a view of the world that is then sort of operationally pertinent to more than a single observer.
Thank you.
There's also, Bruno, I could just add, you didn't mention it, this article called Reflections on the Chilean Civil War that Francisco wrote, where he talks about the polarization of the camps right before September 11th. And he says, so one person would listen to the radio and it would say it is raining, and another person would listen to the radio and would say it was sunny, which is his way of talking about this polarization. And the solution at the end, I can't remember the exact quote, but he talks about how these positions are constructed and they don't correspond to any kind of exterior reality, but that's what we do. We're all creating alternative facts all the time, and that the only way to dissolve this problem is to understand that, or to create systems that know how to undo themselves. And that I find a very interesting statement. And that's at the end of this article, Reflections on the Chilean Civil War.
Very good.
Right. And this undoing comes from the self-referentiality of the constructivist position.
So, there are questions? Any questions?
Enrique, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to come forward and make a comment or a question?
Yeah, maybe it's kind of related to what we're discussing right now. First, thank you for the presentation. It was very fun. I was just thinking, maybe it's a naive question, but I'm really interested in also in the broader context where these theories have evolved and have been constructed. So I'm thinking if you think there is any relationship between the ideation of self-referencing systems and the concept of autopoiesis, and at that time the rising of the concept of self in psychology, and kind of the related shift towards individualism in Western culture in those decades.
I'm not sure. Are you referencing kind of, we now look back and we think of the 80s as at least in American culture, as the return of selfishness and greed has a kind of positive value. Yeah, I don't really know the answer the way whether this material specifically would have had a cultural purchase. I tend to doubt it. I mean, because to me, the sort of the abiding impetus of this discourse is toward consolidation of thought, well, and the background that I really couldn't bring out from what was on offer with the Whole Earth catalog was at least the ideal that the mutual observation of the Earth from space would remind us that we're all in the same boat together. And so there was a countercultural aesthetic which was distinctly communal and searching beyond the sort of the premium on individuality and sort of the American myth, especially in its American inflection of the rugged individual responsible for whatever happens to their life one way or another. So I just think there's an implicit ecological dynamic and that is also in the background, which is captured by the whole Earth ambience. And to me, at least that's the goal, whether it was may have been thwarted or ran into impasses in any possibility. I mean, it's kind of like the larger countercultural moment in American culture. If you were inside it, you thought you saw a revolution in human relationships that would get us beyond the tragedies of the 20th century. And I think the BCL sort of fascinatingly documents the sort of influx of anti-war and psychedelic, wider kind of 60s sensibilities, sort of as a call towards a new communal ethic. To me, that's the sensibility of this material, whether in fact it really gives you the tools to get there. But I think it does if you use them in that way.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
And especially those who are maybe less familiar with this narrative, the story that Bruno's just shared with us, maybe feel free to come forward with your questions as well. Those who may be less familiar with the history of this, be curious to hear where you're entering into this material and how it's landing for you.
Maybe in the meantime, I can ask a question. So I would like to ask, someone else?
Jose?
Jose, yeah.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Hey, Bruce, thank you very much for the talk. That was very nice. Quite all right.
Thanks a lot.
So I would like to go back to this apparently oxymoronic idea of a biological computer. And in particular, I would like to know what is your take on the evolution of the idea of what a computer is? Because nowadays, everything can be seen as a computer. I mean, even a bucket of water can be seen as a computer, and certainly a biological cell can be seen as a computer. And it is almost heretical to talk about cognition without talking about computation. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, you remind me, I didn't go into a bit of detail that von Förster is a good source for. His approach is to expand what we mean by computation and take it out of the sort of the mainstream delimitation of computation to like logic gates in a digital machine, or just mathematical calculation, as the word just comes out of combining numbers and producing, inputting some relationship between certain numbers and then producing an output, and that's your computation. So he would define computation in a way that was capacious enough to include these kinds of neuronal operations that by which a sensory input would yield some kind, a cognitive experience for a nervous system. And so, I mean, he developed a way to uh, 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 where I think semantically, then you would simply want to stipulate, are you talking about mechanical computation? Are you talking about computation, or at least technological computing apparatuses as a mode of machine versus the, in other words, when he would then say, like when Varela just then said, a cell computes its own, basically computes itself as a way of thinking about its autopoiesis. That's why I stipulate biological computation doesn't imply that the body is a machine or is reducible or understandable as ultimately, a set of machinic components that are brought together in a certain way, but have that kind of organic analog sort of, interrelationship, such that you can use that concept to think about the outcomes of biological productions without hauling along the mechanistic metaphor that otherwise kind of impresses itself if you don't. So make a distinction, draw a distinction between different kinds of computation. And I found in just doing systems theory now for the last couple of decades that there's always this problem of equivocation, because there's so many different kinds of systems. And that if you don't stipulate, I'm talking now about design technological systems versus now I'm talking about cellular systems, biological systems, neurological systems, or I'm just talking about like a grammar as a linguistic system. I mean, these are all the very mode and substance of these systems is radically different. And so the stipulation is crucial, just by way of avoiding needless equivocation or thinking that one systems theory fits all, because clearly that's a sort of, that's the reduction that doesn't really get us anywhere. But there's a mode of self-referential systems, for instance, as that will be spoken of in second order cybernetics, with the living system as sort of the base exemplar, okay? But then, of course, the mind, as Varela brought it forth very quickly in one of those later statements we looked at, he talked about a self-conscious system, but that would be the self-reflective system in the mode of cognitive production for a mind per se. So I hope that landed somewhere in the realm of the question you asked. Wolfgang?
Thanks. Go for it,
Wolfgang. Wolfgang has a hand.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask a question. I hope it's a valid question, as it were. In the introduction of Francisco's The Ages of Heinz von Förster, in Francisco's introduction, he quotes Heinz von Förster with, "To understand something is to stand under it so that you may foster its development." And this reminded me of something that I heard on several occasions from Brother David Steindl-Rast, talking about, in a sense, intellectual humility, understanding something, meaning to stand under it, rather than trying to overstand it and control or dominate or exploit, but kind of, be surrendered to being in awe of the great mystery of that which is still, no matter how much we understand, it's still bigger than us. And I was wondering if also that quality, like that quote would also reflect or speak to such a kind of quality in Heinz von Förster and also Francisco as a kind of ethos in how to approach with curiosity and with humility questions that they explored, so that it was possible to oftentimes radically shift their understanding to explore an entirely new kind of theory and really advance also the field and dive into new realms of knowledge. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, if that's
sure. Well,
a valid suspicion.
That's an excellent question. I think you're absolutely right. It speaks to an ethos that von Förster shared with Varela. That was that was, yes, that very what, and part of what that ethos was about was getting away from control-oriented technological cybernetics, right? And in other words, and if you read, for instance, Francisco's very wonderful interview in the Coevolution Quarterly, which I couldn't get to, but you may, which was the successor periodical to the Whole Earth Catalog. So he, and also in 76, it's in the bibliography, and it's you just see what always knocks me out about Varela is how fully formed his scientific and philosophical, his sort of his totality of his intellectual world was so fully formed at such a young age. It blows my mind, and the ethos that is part of that. So what he makes clear there something that I think is an important, might be a revelation. Classical cybernetics is control theory, and one understands, just like the servo mechanisms, like the the thermostat, just perfectly innocuous, but still you've got a device that lays an operational control on another system, and it's the science of these kinds of artifacts. The opposite, or the counter concept to control, is autonomy. And of course, that becomes Varela's sort of leitmotif. I get my German right. And what is autonomy if not, well, so you could say self-control. Control is always control by the other of this thing that's detached from the controller. But autonomy is, you could say, well, takes it back to the self, as we were talking, but in terms of the self's ability to control what, and then the word control begins to kind of start to get loosened up, like the self, literally to name what you are, right? In other words, to the level at which your living experience is emergent from your own conditions and not being put upon you from elsewhere. And so this ethos then, I think, has everything to do with how a scientist approaches the objects of their investigation. As things to be controlled in order to be deciphered or unpacked or analyzed down to the nth instance, or something to be brought into a world that's co-constitutive, in which the object informs the student of its conditions And you get a whole different scientific ethos out of that. And that's why this science is countercultural relative to a mainstream control-oriented, analytically reductive-oriented approach. And I think that's, to me, that's always in the background of my commitment to this material, but I would think it's also why we're kind of here in this lovely Zoom classroom, right? Because we want an alternative that's still perfectly scientific, because we Western minds have to have that, modern Western minds that we are. But understanding, it's also just it's von Förster's wordplay, right? He's just unpacking the German, more or less cognate German term, right? As a way of saying, of orienting understanding towards the support and fostering of the thing that one, once one finds that it's worth understanding, right? That this is a good thought, right? And finally, I think, I don't know how soon you want to wind it up, but I was thinking about that passage, and it got me a pun on von Förster, because a word that Varela used, if I remember correctly, is foster. He likes to foster. Förster the fosterer. Von Förster, who fostered the ideas of Francisco Varela and stood under them as a stalwart supporter but also very much a participant, taking the ride that Francisco was now going to take him on by that point. How's that?
Great. So I think we'll take time just for one more question. I see Rocio had a question.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. I'll make it brief. I don't know if it's on the subject, but I'll just throw it to you. I was wondering about self-regulation and cell metabolism and things like that. I'm a biochemist. I work in a oncology lab recently. So I was wondering about self-regulation and loss of self-regulation in cancer processes, oncology and stuff. And I was wondering if there's any research or line of research or ideas. What I was thinking was how systems are interconnected, and the lack of self-regulation with other systems, it's what makes cancer, let's say, get worse, and the different use of the media, and this is how the tumor gets bigger and stuff. But basically, one of the genetic things that you look for is that it's the loss of, it's a different self-regulation, but it's not the typical self-regulation that the cell has. So it lost self-control. Since it loses self-control, then it gets on this weird thing and they multiply. Eventually you have a tumor. It's more complicated, of course, but in the terms that we're sharing of self-regulation. So I was wondering, in terms of disease, of losing a balance or something like that, and making a parallel with that's very mechanistic controlled, and maybe a parallel with self-regulation and self-regulating systems, and how that can go. It can transform actually in a cancer, in a tumor. And I don't know, maybe there's something about that, or what are your thoughts? Hopefully I can, sure. You know what I'm thinking about.
I think so. And I think it's a really important point that in cancer is a pathology of multicellular bodies and that very multicellularity then draws out a way of mapping the overlapping of organ systems within the kind of bodies that we have evolved to occupy, for instance. So there's all kinds of intercoordination. So and that's why the self. I mean, people, I sort of rightly have probed the limits of the self of self-production or self-organization or self-regulation, because there is a tendency to kind of push aside the true complexity. In other words, there's lots of different selves. There's lots of cellular selves, selfless or not, cellular selves that are bundled together into tissues and organ systems. So my understanding of cancer is that you could say that there's a physiological ecology with regard to our individual, the full complexity of all the different selves, cell types, right? That go in to make up our bodies, and that health for us is the ability of one or the other of these systems to produce a regulatory effect on other parts of the I mean, so it's all a concatenation of subsystems. And cancer is when a certain genetic instruction that is regulated otherwise by other parts of the bodily multiplicity is that is lost, right? Does that sound reasonably correct in that? And then you get this surfeit, you get this out of control tumor, buildup of a tumor from cells that otherwise would be, it's kind of held in place by the normal interregulatory dynamics of the different components of the body. I really don't have any references for you on that, but maybe, I'm sorry, I can't throw one out your way, but I think it's maybe someone has and can bring it to the group, and that would be really fascinating to know.
So, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for other questions. I'm sure that everybody would have a lot of questions and envy and energy to go on, but this is our frame. I would like to thank you again, Bruno, really for this wonderful lecture. Really, it was super inspiring for me, and I think for everybody to see your reconstruction, your interpretation of the flow of experimental epistemology from McCulloch to Francisco Varela's work. So this was really, really very inspiring, very deep. So thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
So then we will have during the next session, we will have Juan Carlos Letelier for a second session on the cybernetics origins of Enaction. And this will allow us to see from a complementary perspective also the flow of the evolution of experimental epistemology from McCulloch, but Heinz von Förster, the collaboration of Francisco Varela with Maturana to the theory of autopoiesis, and then his own work on autonomous systems. And this lecture will be held on the 19th of October. And then on the 26th of October, we will have Tom Zinke, and who will start the phase of our genealogical path dedicated to autopoiesis. So this will be the first session dedicated to autopoiesis. And 26th of October, always from 6 to 8. So thank you very much. Thank you, Joanna.
Great. And then there's one last event we wanted to announce because you may be interested. We have our new EVA alumni series. And so we have alumni from this, the European Varela Award grant program. And so our next speaker will be Michelle Carr. She'll be giving a talk on her research project funded by the program on October 20th. So you're welcome to all three of these upcoming events in October. And we'll see you back for the next course then on October 19th in just over 3 weeks. Thanks so much once again, Bruno, and to everyone else. And have a good evening.